Greetings once again. Claude here. John should be joining us shortly, the real John, that is. Okay, on our topic today, we're going to be talking about renovations versus new builds. So as you can see in the slide, we have two different images, one of an older home and one of a newer home. So is it really true that renovations or remodels may take more time than a build for a new home? So the answer to this question, it really depends on a number of things, including what needs to be done. Certainly, if we look at the photo on the left, it gives the impression that most likely there are quite a few things that need to be completed, and it may be beyond the renovation stage. Or is that really the case? So an overview of this presentation, just a few questions that I wanted to pose. So what's important to consider? Is tearing down and starting from scratch the solution? What about the time factor? Does new construction always take longer? Which is the most cost effective? How much money do you want to spend? But before deciding, it's good to be aware of all of these considerations. For instance, which option is more cost effective and which one is less time consuming? Or can we get the best of both, cost effectiveness and better timing? Or is it more about the extent of really the scope of work? So let's dig in and take a look. Well, when we start taking a look at it, some of the important considerations, as we can see listed here: time, certainly a huge factor; the budget, affordability, certainly cost. Should be looking at existing or really starting from new? And that was really back to the kind of the original question. What about the structural integrity of the existing? What about system upgrades? Or how about potential hazardous materials, for example, just occupant safety? Or do we need to take a look at it from a different perspective, for example, layout or usability for the occupants, or simply adding more space, or improving energy efficiency? Or really, it really depends on getting back to the scope of work, really our goals. So once again, we can see in the photos depiction of a newer house. And of course, we'll call it the hodgepodge of what the heck were they thinking? So let's think about a few more important considerations. Analyzing the existing building conditions. How about limitations? Do we need to check the local planning and see what regulations may impact a renovation or even a new build? Of course, there's other things, could be accommodations for aged or barrier-free accessibility. What about the drawings and the whole planning of this? What's required? I need to create a plan of action here. Or I also need to get estimates. And I always recommend that at least get 3 bids so I can have a point of comparison. Am I comparing an apple with an apple or an apple with something different? So minimize the waste in materials. So when we think about construction in general, whether it's a renovation or even a new build, often there's a waste in materials. Can we try and minimize the waste of materials? And of course, quality versus affordability. Of course, quality means more money. Affordability, well, that's basically what can we afford? What can be spent? What is the budget? So we start taking a look at that. We should also be thinking about requesting and getting some timelines, because simply I find too often work can simply drag on if there isn't a timeline or sort of a deadline set for the work, regardless of whether it's a renovation or a new build. Of course, another important thing, if you look at it from our perspective, can you live in the house during the renovation work? Well, here's a number of depictions. Is it a renovate, or is it really a repair? And we can see all of these require some degree of work. So a few other details we should be taking a look at. So for example, if we renovate, it's, as I mentioned before, the potential impact on the structural system. Is it something that can be readily done? Or is the structural system been compromised and needs some major repairs and work itself? Renovation also generally is bound to an existing structure. Certainly renovating could also mean adding on to something that's existing, but we're really working with the exterior shell of the building and perhaps saving most of what we can structurally on the interior. And of course, when we think about renovation, is it worth the extra money as an investment? So is there a value left in the house? Or is there something that maybe we should consider as maybe not a good investment? And of course, extensive damage or repairs likely means a rebuild is necessary. Of course, when we start thinking about things from a new perspective, a new build, starting right from the beginning, including servicing the land for the build, and generally larger is going to be larger in the scope of work. So again, we're trying to think about a lot of the different considerations and details that we need to think about when we talk about a renovation versus the build. When we take a look at the next slide here, we can see, well, another old sort of dilapidated house, certainly in need of repair. So is it a tear down? So what's the extent of the work? Can something be saved? Is it a partial or a full remodel or new? Can it be repurposed at all? And if we think about it, current state of the existing, is it extensive or minor work? And again, I mentioned the issue about hazardous materials. Older structures tend to have some materials that may contain hazardous materials such as asbestos, vermiculite, and a number of other potential, we'll call it toxicity type issues. Is it really a healthy house or an unhealthy house? Certainly if it's riddled with mold, probably it could be the tear down. And is it simply unfit for occupation? So when we think about this, you know, this certainly is an example of a tear down is occurred on certainly this old house. Well, our next grouping here, we can see something much newer. So again, some of the First Nation housing units in my area or close to my area, southwestern Ontario, we can see a lot of different derivatives of some good new builds. So when we think about this, we can see certainly clean, nice looking, but certainly we have to also admit this is all brand new construction, or for the most part, fairly new construction. So what about the new build side of things? I talked a little bit of should we renovate or should we now think about the new build side of things? So when we start thinking about considerations on a new build, we have to start probably with the beginning of planning, perhaps permits, incorporation of modern technology designed to mitigate climate change. So one of the big factors nowadays in new builds is to certainly have a house that's more adapted to the change in climates, but also something that's going to be very energy efficient. Certainly, if codes are involved, will it meet new codes or must it meet new codes? But certainly, new builds can be more expensive, and we'll get into that a little bit more in upcoming slides. What about new materials? Can we find some that are potentially less maintenance? You know, other materials out there, certainly, as we can see on some of the older houses, probably more maintenance was involved, or perhaps simply lack of maintenance. So more materials, that's more labor hours, and it's certainly more complex in the scope of work when we consider a new build, right from the very start, from the planning stage to the estimating or getting pricing stage and into the actual build stage. And of course, other things we have to think about with a new build is certainly, for the most part, the impact of weather. Because again, How do you get the footings, the foundations, and even the framing up if we are in inclement weather? Certainly with a renovation, we could be doing work indoors and maybe finishing the work that's required outdoors when it's more suitable. The other big factor is certainly the availability of skilled trades. On any build, in fact, in many renovations even, we have to consider the fact, are there skilled trades available to basically do the work? Well, let's talk about costs. When we talk about costs, we are going to look at a few factors here. So the average cost for a new build is $200 to $300 per square foot, and it depends on the materials and finishes. My wife and I were out to a builder's, we'll say, open house, and that house was a large house. It was roughly 4,000 square feet, and they were asking over $2 million. That's a lot of money, and I calculated that out as roughly $600 per square foot. So in the $500 to $600 per square foot range, which is a lot of money. But getting back to the points here on this particular slide, renovating is generally less expensive. So the average home renovation is about half cost of a new build. But again, renovations depends on the type of work, the scope of work. But renovations typically can involve dismantling. Thus, they become very labor intensive. So the costs tend to be higher and more intensive when we talk about the labor factor. Some more on cost factors. Costs vary with time and locality. Material shortages often resulted in severe price fluctuations of materials. So again, if we take a look at the new build, and even in the cases of renovations, the cost of materials have gone up dramatically, especially some of the materials I look at as basically simple framing materials, the price of a 2x4, a sheet of plywood, and so on. So again, the costs have risen dramatically, and certainly this has a major cost factor overall on the cost of construction, whether it be a renovation or a new build. The other significant concern is locating and getting materials to the site. In my area, we have probably 4 lumber yards that I can get materials fairly readily locally. But again, in some areas, you may be really strapped at trying to get materials to your community. So again, we have other factors, not just getting the materials, but what's going to cost to get the materials to the job site. So again, labor is also a significant part of the total construction costs. So often labor itself can be more than 50% of the total cost of any build. Unfortunately, it seems while labor has increased, there's also a lot of consideration that not necessarily the productivity rather has increased. In fact, in most cases, it's younger, less experienced people, which means probably a decrease in the actual labor. Well, here's some sample costs. Let's talk about some renovation costs. So again, these are just some ballpark estimates. So when we start taking a look at the sample renovation costs, so for just a bathroom alone, could be $8,000 to $10,000. Let's say a kitchen refitted with new kitchen cabinets, not appliances, roughly $12,000 to $15,000. Certainly it could be done for less. It certainly can be done for more. It's really what is affordable within the budget. But again, these are just some sample costs to kind of give us some general ideas. Electrical upgrade from, say, a 60 amp to 100 amp service could be in the range of roughly $2,000, or a high efficiency furnace in the range of $4,000 to $5,000, or simply a replacement of a toilet at roughly $500. Repainting interior, $1,000 to $2,000. Replacing the outside exterior door, roughly $1,000, possibly even more. Reshingling the roof, $4,000 to $6,000. And adding vinyl siding, $5,000 to $6,000, or simply replacing a window, roughly $1,000 to $1,200. So we can get some general ideas that when we look at renovations in general, these are some of the sample costs to kind of give us an idea of what it would be possibly for a renovation. Again, I caution these are simply ballpark figures, not necessarily the exact figure, and that's why I always say it's great to try and seek out 3 different cost estimates or bids for your particular project. Moving on to the next slide. How about the time factor? I touched a little bit about the issue of what about time? So renovations are typically much quicker than a new build. The average for a new house build can range from 3 to 4 months and perhaps upwards to 6 months. I know some of the builders here, again, larger houses will be over a year or a year plus in time. And again, it depends on the availability of the contractor or the builder. So it has a number of different things that can play into, and we have to think about, take into consideration. The average for a remodel, on the other hand, could be 2 to 3 months, or perhaps if it's something a lot simpler, perhaps weeks, or perhaps just a month. So for a simple remodel. So again, some examples here. The bathroom remodel can be disruptive, but generally can be completed in about 2 weeks on average, providing all the materials are readily available. And of course, the workers are on site to do the work. The average small bathroom remodel costs, as I mentioned before, roughly $10,000 plus. Likewise, roofing and siding is less disruptive, but averages about the same time frame, roughly 2 weeks for both to be completed. And the average cost for about 1,000 square foot home with vinyl siding and asphalt shingle roofing just to be replaced is going to be in a ballpark figure of perhaps around $21,000 or more. So a few more considerations. So when we think about even more these other considerations, some things may be simple or easy, but certainly good, effective organization is also important. As I mentioned before, the labor and workforce, or the workers on site, is a key factor that can either cost money or slow down the time frame, certainly for construction. More importantly, as I mentioned, things can tend to drag out. Perhaps consider what can be done in a house in the meantime. So again, when we think about the renovation work sequence, we need to think about it from, we'll call it a process point of view. So stripping out the existing features and removing anything you cannot reuse. Structural repairs and work such as flooring, ceiling, and roofing and walls certainly are important parts of any renovation work. And certainly we have to think about the trade work. So again, we have to get the plumber, or certainly the plumbing, electrical, heating, and ventilation, and certainly insulation. Some of these may be done, by local help, but certainly some of these require probably more expertise when it comes to things such as electrical and heating. And of course, the next thing we need to think about is, from a work point of view, is completing the wall, ceilings, and flooring. And certainly towards the finishing stages, installing features such as counters, fixtures, cabinetry, and certainly more little details. And getting towards the latter stages is finishing touches to ensure, we'll call it the flawlessness or the expectation of having a finished renovation project. And of course, the final cleanup and testing. So in the final cleanup and testing stage is also important, because was the work done according to the original scope of work? Do things work, for example, the taps or the lighting and so on, or the heating system? So again, we need to think about these different systems that are at play when we get into certainly a renovation, and also likewise, also similarly in a new build. Certainly when we look at the sequence of work for a new build, we're really starting from scratch. As I mentioned before, we have to think about plans, permits, layout, services to the to the building or house. Certainly, another time-consuming thing is excavation and the foundations in connection of all these services into the building or house. Then we have to think about the structure and the framing. And of course, if we've had some excavation and foundation work, we have to think about the backfill and grading. And then we get into, once the framing is done, is also all this trade work. So including all that building envelope and certainly all the various services. Again, plumbing, electrical, heating, ventilation, and so on. And then basically the completion or the installation of wall ceilings and floorings. And again, installing the features, as I mentioned before, and certainly the finishing touches to ensure, again, flawlessness in the final cleanup and takeover, hence, hopefully, occupancy of the new build. Again, inspections being part of the process, or at least to have some quality control on the work on site. So what are some of the common mistakes that can be made when we think about renovation versus new build? So when we think about that, buying cheap materials, choosing low-end materials may help cut down costs immediately. However, is it going to be the best for overall impact for longevity over the longer period of time? How about just simply ignoring details? So some of the details, for example, are specific features required when renovating. So is it going to be a person that's living in it that has special needs? Therefore, some of the details need to be taken into account of what is required to meet these barrier-free conditions. And of course, we can take a look at it from the contractor's perspective. You know, possibly the cutting of corners, substitution of materials, and certainly changes that may occur. And of course, not considering the long-term needs. Is it beneficial to look at the big picture, making an informed decision right from the get-go to ensure that the home is well organized, functional, and equipped to meet certainly even the future needs? When I think about things like that, getting back to ignoring details, grab bars. Grab bars are important, again, for safety when we think about not just barrier-free, but certainly for people that are maybe, you know, a little bit unstable walking and so on. So again, to help certainly even the elderly. So I've added in here some renovation cost references. So when we take a look at that, there's 3 sites that I looked at. So again, you can get some general ideas of costs, and some of the costs that I indicated earlier are actually taken from those particular websites. So when we think about it, so you can get what you want. How much will it cost to renovate or repair your Toronto house? Certainly, it's certainly Toronto-based, but it gives us even a general idea. There's another one, the Reno Assistance, cost price, cost of home renovation, or a Donna Backer renovation pricing guide. So again, a few general reference links that you could think about or click on and get some further information. So again, we think about new build prices. Now, I'm not current and up to date on what the cost would be for your community, but here are some ballpark ideas of the price per square foot, getting back to the cost per square foot for a detached home in a major Canadian city. And again, this was taken from a REMAX, certainly a real estate realtor site. How much does it cost to build a house? So we can see when we go through the list here, Vancouver seems to be even more expensive for the most part than, let's say, even the greater Toronto area. Again, Toronto being probably second to Vancouver. So we can see a cost of $275 per square foot. So again, when we start multiplying that number by, you know, let's say 1,000 square feet, there probably is going to be a very expensive build for a house. Likewise, I've shown way down towards the bottom in the city of Halifax, roughly the lowest price I could find per square foot was $100 per square foot. And You know, I was thinking about when my son was going to build a house that we could do it for roughly $100 a square foot, which we could do. But the thing is, that involves us doing a lot of the labor. So again, that $100 per square foot. And again, the remoteness certainly has a huge factor when we start looking at, again, what would it cost in your community for a new build when we look at pricing. So I looked at it from another perspective, and this was the sources we can see at the bottom, Altus Group, 2022 Canadian Cost Guide. And this construction cost data, private sector price per square foot. And again, you'll see across the top, most of the cities that were on the previous slide, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, GTA, Greater Toronto Area, Ottawa, Montreal, Halifax, and St. John's. And based on the type of, we'll call it a dwelling unit, so condominiums and apartments in the middle of the wood frame residential construction or seniors housing. So we can see that for the most part, that it's over $200 easily per square foot for just about any type of build when it comes to new construction, possibly higher. And again, the price is always going to be fluctuating based on materials and availability, and also the work and the builder's choice of how much money they want to make on a particular build. So again, when we get back to the issue of renovation in, you know, a new build, we need to think about a few things in general. So in my closing thoughts, I note there are benefits and drawbacks really to both. You will really have to weigh and determine which option is best for your particular needs unless you have a detailed scope of work. Certainly obtain several quotes and determine which option really best fits your budget. So again, following a proper process will aid in gathering all possible information about a property to help in your decision making. We also need to look at answering such a question: renovate or new? Of course, this depends on a wide range of factors as we presented, or I presented earlier, unique to each individual project. And deciding between renovating an old home or building a new home will come down to this certainly specific circumstances. So I thank you. Certainly this was a very quick presentation, probably one of the faster ones or shorter ones. I certainly, your thoughts or decisions on renovating or building, certainly the floor is open for any questions, if you have any questions. Okay, Rami, certainly, please go ahead. You want to unmute your mic? Okay, I see in the chat, I find it difficult to basically to even get two quotes. And that is, you know, that is unfortunately part of the, it seems to be certainly a current issue, because I know, okay, so sorry about that, my audio does not work. But anyways, on the issue of trying to even get two quotes, yes, it certainly can be difficult, and it's like really a lot of time can be spent on the process of trying to get quotes, because it depends on whether they're busy. In my particular area, I'm down in Windsor, Ontario, and for the most part, all the builders are building, and they said, you know, if you want a price on getting something built, come and see us a couple of years from now, which is basically not what you really want to hear. So when I think about it, I'm not surprised for the most part that a lot of the people are fairly busy.
File I believe it's in, on the back filing cabinet beside my desk. It should be right in the middle. I think it says Naomi unit on it. If you
Yes.
want to have a peek through there and see if Matt sent me the blueprint or not back in the day, it would be in her file folder. If we don't, then I have to request it from NBC because I remember seeing one, but I don't know if I physically printed it off or not.
Okay, hang on. I'm gonna open your door.
I'm sorry, was that it?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just have a peek at every single one of the papers in there and let me know if it's in there or not.
Hi, Sheila. Was that, were you posing a question? Okay, just before I sign off, are there any questions that any of you might have before we kind of finish this particular session? If not, I thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again next week for our other upcoming webinars. Again, thank you.